Afrika, Silber.
Through Ebola, we exclude a whole continent.
Ebola was a disaster.
We are losing so many doctors, so many nurses.
Wenn so eine Epidemie in einer anderen Region der Welt ausbricht, dass das mehr Aufmerksamkeit auf sich gezogen hätte.
Well, why we've organized this discussion and why we are focusing more on the political side, not so much on the medical side, but at the political dimension of the Ebola crisis. According to the latest figures from the World Health Organization, over 9,100 people have died. Approximately 23,000 have been infected with the Ebola virus. Many experts argue that the Ebola crisis has reached such a huge dimension because the response, mainly the international response, was too late, was too little. This might be one aspect of our debate. Another aspect might be what's the situation of the health sector in the affected countries, in Liberia, in Guinea, in Sierra Leone, and what's the role of other policymakers?
I would like to start with you, Fatou, since you have come back from Guinea only a few days ago. Can you give us a picture of the current situation in Guinea?
It is a very emotional situation to see, because it's a disease that is not like the other diseases. First of all, it's a new disease for the three countries, particularly Guinea, but also Liberia and Sierra Leone. They didn't know Ebola, and we have known Ebola for a long time, but in different countries. And I think that this is also a reason why the disease was not well explained, not just in country, but also to the rest of the world. And so it seemed to be a new disease for the rest of the world as well. And so things were not explained in the way that you could understand where the risk actually is and where it actually isn't. So there is a reason why in Guinea you have 12 million people, but you only have 3,000 people who got infected, not the whole, 10 million or whatever. So there is a reason. And because this disease you only get through somebody who's actually sick, not somebody who just, has a virus and can transmit it to you, but you have to be really sick to transmit it. And you also have to be really sick to get a test that is positive. And so if people had explained this, you could understand that you only are at risk if you are around people who are very sick or people who are dead. And the people who are with very sick people or dead people are doctors, nurses, people who work in hospitals, traditional healers, people who work in the morgues. But it's not you and, people walking down the streets. It's very unlikely for you to meet anybody really sick or dead. And so I think that there is this difference between the perception of people who know what this disease is about and where the danger is, and the rest of the world who actually has this panic and fear that is completely unfocused on where it should be. And the consequence of this is that the people who actually are at risk for a very long time haven't known that they were the ones who were really at risk. Their fear was just the same as everyone else, but they didn't understand that they were the ones who were really at risk. And so what my work was very much about, it was about explaining the disease to those who were the most at risk, so they could understand why for them this was really important. And because they didn't know how much at risk they were also very often the ones who did not accept the response, because they were not used to be the target of the disease. It's not common for doctors, nurses, traditional healers, and people from the morgues to be the ones who are actually at risk. And this is where it's really, for me, really tricky, because we are losing so many doctors, so many nurses, so many traditional healers, so many people who are working in our hospitals and health facilities, and they're all dying. And when people say, oh, we have to make sure that we can build health systems again, you're like, yes, but with whom? You know, these are the people who should be in those health facilities tomorrow, and they're dying today.
I would label it the international NGOs and humanitarians reacted and struggled. But the more systematic coordination support and leadership of the UN was missing, and a multinational, multi-agency coordination mechanism, which is essential normally for a humanitarian response, was completely absent. So let me move to the shortcomings of the UN and other multilateral. And there the critics mainly focused on WHO. And there were three clusters of critics. One was on the organizational and human capacity of WHO. What I call very bluntly the incompetence of WHO country representatives, which actually did not react for many, many months being in place. And the dysfunctioning of a regional office in Africa, AFRO, which is known to be the weakest in WHO, but still did not work up to the need.
As we said, this outbreak reached a dimension which no one ever had made experience before with. So our MSF protocols were kind of designed for treatment centers for 20 people in the beginning. So we constantly had to adapt, and we ended up with treatment centers of 200 people, which were by September, which were full. All beds were full. So we even in August, September, had to turn away people. As a matter of fact, we've kind of did not accept money from governments, which would have been happy to give us the money. We actually explicitly called upon governments, and this was already in the stage of September, October. We said, okay, it's not about the money; it's about direct action on the ground.
What we needed really was to know who had Ebola and who didn't have Ebola. This was the major concern for everybody, which meant that you had to go to an Ebola treatment center just to know if you had Ebola or not. And this already made people suspicious, because they said, whenever we go to a hospital or to a health center, we usually have a test there. Why should we go in that very strange place with people dressed in such strange ways, in a place where when you come out dead from there, we can't see the dead body. We can't see any clothes of the dead person because they are burned. We don't have any information on what goes on. Why, for just a test, should I go in that place? So already, in terms of did we respond well enough that we didn't immediately propose a response where the lab was central, didn't help, because it made people suspicious. Why do you have to put those labs in the Ebola treatment centers? And in a country like Guinea, where up until 3 months ago, we only had 2 Ebola treatment centers for the whole country, you had to travel the whole country if you had a fever or a diarrhea, just to know if you had Ebola. And so this already made people suspicious. We're talking about a virus, which is something we can't show to people. We can only show electronic microscopy pictures. So what are we doing in an Ebola treatment center? Unless you explain that the immune system is the one going to do everything, people don't understand. And they all thought, in all the trainings that I attended, they all thought that the immune system was the one that was being destroyed by the virus. They thought it was like HIV, because the only explanation we gave in terms of disease in a very detailed way over the last 10 years was on HIV. They thought that viruses destroy the immune system. And so they thought, you don't have a treatment for the virus, the immune system is destroyed. What are we doing in that Ebola treatment center? And remember, in Guinea, you have 60% mortality rate. It's changed over the last month and a half. Treatment centers have changed the way they treat, let's put it this way. But in the beginning, the fact that rehydration was only oral, I mean, it really meant that we had death rates because it was so high that it was very difficult for people to make sense of what we were saying. So I think it really needed far more explanation. And I think when I listened to those concerns, I could understand why violence was the response at some point. And to say, you know, we're sorry, but you're not making any sense to us. And so through those trainings, what I came to realize was that it wasn't so much you didn't do enough, you didn't do it on time, but it's just you're not making sense.
But do you share, for instance, Stefan's point that one of the problems was the incompetence of WHO country representatives, that their jobs were more kind of politically motivated appointments, which had nothing to do with health knowledge, which led to a slow response in the affected countries. Do you share this point of view?
What is the role of WHO? WHO is a technical agency. So as far as I'm concerned, WHO has a role in providing guidelines, in making sure that what happens in Ebola treatment centers is actually coherent with today's medical knowledge, which I don't think they looked into well enough. But because of the lead role that MSF probably and other actors involved in Ebola treatment centers took, there was no oversight of the technical quality of what was provided in those centers. And I don't blame anybody, because as our colleague from MSF was saying, they were very clear about the fact that they needed help and they needed support, and that support was required. But I think that we should have been more open about the kind of support that was required. It was not just more people, more money, and quicker. It was also getting the science right.
From your perspective, Fatou, can we say that there is political responsibility for the dimension of the Ebola epidemic?
So political responsibility for me is more in terms of actually who makes the decisions really in the political arena. And in the end, it's money, it's power. And I mean, for example, as our colleague was saying before, most of the funds went to UN agencies. Now, except for WFP, who is a UN agency, but is a doer and really did stuff. I mean, in Guinea, you can see it. I mean, I'm not sure what the other UN agencies in terms of implementation would do with the money. And the national coordination is held responsible by the people in Guinea of everything that happens on Ebola. Yet the amount of funding that goes to that Ebola coordination is absolutely ridiculous compared to what, you know, the UN agencies and NGOs get.
I think one of the core problems we had very, very weak health system, and that was mentioned already in the very beginning. And it is partly the responsibility of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, who make sure that we are not ending in such a situation. So in order to prevent such outbreak, most probably the best strategy would be, and the best thing for the people as well, would be to have reasonable health system in place. So that is the first thing. Then the question is, how do we respond better and quicker? And obviously, when you have a stronger health system, you have a better local capacity. So that should be already the starting point. And then if we need more, if we need international support, then we need to have the system in place and the funding mechanism in place. To raise funds 8 months after the outbreak of such an epidemic is a painful exercise. And in this, during the course, I mean, we as an international NGOs, we were actually put into a situation where we were competing against each other in terms of funding. We cooperated, that is our dilemma, we cooperate on the ground, but we were competing for something like the personal protective equipment, which was running out in the world sometimes.
This is a scenario which we have seen many, many times before at many, many different disasters. And each time after disaster, organizations say we can't compete so much anymore. But how will it be the next time? What is your proposal?
I mean, what the World Bank proposes is a kind of fund, emergency fund, which could be dispatched quickly to implementing agency. And that would be a way forward. The question is how to disperse this in a way that is not bureaucratic, which is on time and easy to access. Then we would not be in that position that we actually fight for resources, and not only money, it is people, it is equipment, it's everything. Then we can actually work together effectively. That is one of the preconditions which should be considered in the future.
From our point of view, and really it's a very MSF perspective, is what we've seen that many big INGOs kind of outsourcing towards local NGOs. And this might be correct in some context, but what we think in typically violent context and context where you need highly qualified staff, I think as you mentioned, you have to be a doer. You have to do some things yourself. You cannot kind of disengage with certain kind of field work on the ground. And I think this is what we see with many, many agencies, especially agencies who are under the UN cluster. And we had some very interesting discussions with UN OCHA, who sees it actually pretty much the same way, which is interesting. Yeah, and due to the fact that you kind of
sorry to interrupt you again, so that everybody understands this. You mean that within the UN agencies, they more and more delegate the tasks to local organizations which, from your point of view, are not capable, are not able to cope with the amount of aid which has to be done.
What they've also lost with the kind of outsourcing is the ability to analyze situation, especially to analyze the risk on the ground. And this is, I've been just last June, July in South Sudan, and I've been on cluster meetings with big INGOs and UN where it was just, I mean, I thought it was ridiculous, you know, in terms of the evaluation of the risk situation on the ground in South Sudan, you know, being, you know, on a compound, you know, not leaving the compound and not actually knowing what's going on outside is kind of a sign of that you're just there for a certain part of the population. We have to kind of, you know, on some level, kind of come back to the more what we would call classical humanitarian aid, which, you know, the International Red Cross and MSF is standing for. And we've been quite often criticized for our, let's say, boots on the ground mentality. Yeah? But it might not be the right approach in some context, but in this context, I think it's absolutely necessary and has proven to be actually quite a good approach in the Ebola outbreak, to have international people working together with local staff.
I now would like to open the panel with questions from the audience.
I want to emphasize on the role of WHO. It's supposed to be an organization which is in charge of the world health. Maybe only 400 people have died, but that organization, with all the money they get, they have the primary responsibility of the health. Why they don't have anything, not even a mechanism in place to react quickly? And since you have approached them, I assume, what do they promise to do better next time? Do we wait again 40 years to have another disease, so they come out and say they have nothing in place?
I try to answer as good as possible. I'm not defending WHO, for sure not. But in all fairness, they're just in a very weak position. And also one have to take into consideration, because we've also thought about, like, you know, research and development on we do it on other neglected diseases, but also we thought about on Ebola, but it's not so easy, because there are some very legal issues on it. Who has been doing some research on it has been the military. Mm-hmm. And mainly due to the fact that it could be used, the Ebola virus could have been used as a weapon, a terrorist weapon. So there are some I would say very striking legal issues to it, which is sad to it. But I think Ebola has been the perfect poster child for what our current research and development system actually is broken. Because, I mean, we shouldn't be naive. You know, the pharma industry won't invest into development of treatment and vaccines for a disease which, as you mentioned, you know, has had numbers of victims for 400. But what we should do, and what we've been doing for other diseases like HIV, like other neglected diseases, like to propose different ways of funding for research and development. But and then the WHO role, I mean, it comes very late, but we are now involved in 3 experimental trials, clinical trials in Guinea, in Sierra Leone, and in Liberia, while the one in Liberia has been stopped now. But this week, actually, there is one starting where we part of it, which is actually under the lead of WHO. So there are things moving, but it's a very bureaucratic organization, so it's very slow, and it takes time.
This is something, I mean, I'm from Nigeria, and Nigeria had very briefly its own case of Ebola. And I think you talk extensively about the response we saw from people. They were scared because they didn't understand the narrative that was given to them about Ebola. In Nigeria, what helped perhaps was the initial response was really from the sensitization that spread around the country. It was, you know, people were paranoid, but perhaps that helped. So how do you think these can be capitalized, the lessons we learn, in terms of the narrative that is given? Because really, before we wait for the big organizations, the first response is the sensitization that is given to people. How do you think this can be leveraged in the future to be able to effectively respond? Thank you.
Sensitization, yes, but what is it that you say in that sensitization?